Albert Einstein said, "Don't think about why you question, simply don't stop questioning." Welcome to Curated Questions. I am your host, Ken Woodward. And these questions are not mathematical equations, but rather a resource to encounter personal reflection and growth. As Tupac Shakur stated, even the genius asks questions. Now, let's engage the questioning community. Greetings, Ken Woodward here. Welcome back to another episode of Curated Questions. Together, we engage inquisitive humans about how they use questions to navigate and make sense of our world. I'm a fellow traveler and pilgrim on this journey, and I'm glad you're here. Today's conversation is with Austin Graff, which is spelled Graff. He can be found on Instagram at Austin K. Graff, and his website is austinkgraff.com. Austin grew up in Russia and Kazakhstan, returned to the United States for college in Michigan, then moved to Washington, D.C. His talents have been expressed primarily through digital and social marketing for nonprofits and large companies, such as Coca-Cola and until recently, The Washington Post. In 2022, he launched Curiosity and Connection, which combines media consulting and travel guides. He is married, and his daughter joins him as he explores and writes about D.C.'s 131 neighborhoods and various global destinations. For those who like statistics, Austin's Google review numbers include nearly 4,300 reviews, 18,400 answers, 60,000 photos, 1,800 videos, and over 900 facts checked. So one of the things I appreciate about Austin is he is the epitome of a person who fully lives life. Austin, welcome to Curated Questions.
Thank you so much. That was quite the intro. And I do appreciate two things. One, I love facts. And so it was fun to have that read back to me about my obsession with writing reviews for Google Maps and Yelp, which my friends and wife often make fun of me for. But Google has a program where every year they choose a handful of the top, what's called local guides, people who obsessively write reviews and upload photos and videos. And I was that a few years ago, and it was like the honor of my life. And the second thing is I appreciate that you spelled my name, because often people think I say grass, like the green, like a lawn. And especially telemarketers, or when I call a doctor, they're like, "Oh yeah, Austin Grass." So I appreciate that you noted that it's two F's and it's Graff. But I'm excited to be here.
Excellent. I'm glad I was able to bless you with those little things right at the jump. That's cool. One of the things out of the bio, Russia and Kazakhstan are not the standard zip codes for an American child. Can you fill in some of the details for those that have not yet heard the story?
Yeah, you're right. They aren't common zip codes and have entirely different zip codes than those that we have in the US. But I'm what's called a third culture kid. Or some people like to call third culture kids, or TCKs, kind of a reverse immigrant or hidden immigrant. But essentially, I was born in the United States to American parents. But because of my parents' jobs, we moved overseas when I was a very young child. And so I grew up in the most Muslim part of Russia called Tatarstan, the land of the Tatars, which not too many people in North America have heard of Tatarstan, but it's kind of similar to how Puerto Rico is to the United States, where it's part of Russia, but still very much independent as well. So up until recently, we were able to elect our own president. We had our own international trade deals that were separate from Russia. We have our own flag and all these things. They're Muslim versus Russian Orthodox, and the Tatar people looked different than Caucasian Russians. And so that's where I grew up. And then I went to a Canadian boarding school in Southwest Germany for high school, but would travel home to Tatarstan. I grew up in the capital of Tatarstan called Kazan, which is a few million people. And then when I came to university in the United States, my parents moved to Kazakhstan, mainly because they got what's called blacklisted in Russia, where if the government, if they sense that you are there for reasons that they don't like. For example, they sometimes accuse Americans for being spies. My parents were not, to my knowledge, but for whatever reason, they were blacklisted. So they had to leave where I grew up, and they moved to Almaty, Kazakhstan, where they lived for a long time as well. So when I would visit my parents post college, it would take me to Kazakhstan, which is a beautiful country in Central Asia.
Wow, that is fantastic. How did that foster curiosity and questions?
Yeah, it did very much foster curiosity and questions because for third culture kids and a lot of immigrants may feel similar and other types of people, we don't often feel like we have a home that is ours. Because when I was growing up in Tatarstan, even though that was home, I spoke the local language like a local. Despite all of that, I was still known as the American because my parents were American. My parents they have strong accents when they speak Russian and when they speak Tatar. Oftentimes when we went shopping, people couldn't understand them because of their accents. So they look at us kids saying, "What are your parents trying to say?" And so we definitely stood out where I grew up. And I don't look Tatar at all. And so we were very much kind of the foreigner living in this land. But yeah, that's where I grew up. So I felt very much kind of like local, but wasn't fully accepted. And then when I came to the United States, which was my passport country, I just don't at all to this day feel American because I didn't grow up here. And so any pop culture reference from when I was a newborn baby to pre-college is just lost on me. And I'm known as the Russian or the Tatar when I'm in the United States. And so as a result, I kind of don't have a home. And so I'm always in this posture of being a guest, no matter where I'm at, even in a place that people may assume is my home. And when you're someone's guest, one of the best ways to connect with the people who are from a place is to ask them questions, is to have this model of curiosity that you carry about you and where you have to ask good questions, but even more importantly, you have to listen and just create the space for people to be able to tell their stories because they're from the place in which you find yourself in. Whereas I don't necessarily have that. And so going to boarding school in Germany was a beautiful space for me because it was full of third culture kids. And so, for example, in my all boy dorm in high school, because it was a boarding school, we had 32 guys and from all around the world. And so one of my good friends, he's ethnically South Korean, but he grew up in Turkey. And then another friend who's ethnically German, but grew up in Lebanon, or someone who's Australian, but grew up in Brazil. And so all of us are third culture kids and come from very different passport countries, but also countries in which we grew up. But we could fully relate to each other because all of us know what it's like to be the outsider, to always be a guest in a place, to not have a home. And that was the only time in my life that I felt like I kind of belonged in a place. All other spaces, even in Washington, D.C., a city that I love and have lived in for almost 20 years, I'm still very much a guest because I'm not a native Washingtonian. And again, that forces you to ask questions and try to create space to let other people's stories be heard and to be known and to be felt and to be understood.
Amazing. As I read your writing or your focus on social media, you are very conscious of what others might consider the others. In your time in DC, you're very quick to point out a Black history or the Black community's points of culture or indigenous cultures as you've done your travel, which I've really appreciated because it's so easy to gloss over the top headlines of a particular place. Has that grown out of that kind of third person kind of background, you think?
Yes, yeah, it definitely has grown out of being a third culture kid because, again, never having a home, but also because of the nature of my parents' jobs and just growing up in Eurasia. It was a lot more accessible for our family to travel. Trains are very affordable and extensive throughout that whole region. And so we would travel all the time. So before I was 18, I've been to almost 80 different countries. So going into a space, I just am very much aware that I'm I need to respect the people who are from here, the people that cherish this place, because there's all these nuances that are lost on me because I'm just here for 2 weeks or a month, or even in DC for almost 20 years. There's still things that I lose out on just because I didn't grow up here. And you just have to respect the people who come before all of us. And Washington, D.C. in particular is an interesting city to be in because at one point it was the most black city in the United States of America. And that has changed. It's gone from Chocolate City to now people reference it as Cappuccino City, where there's kind of a mix of different cultural and racial backgrounds. But then even despite all of that, one of my friends who is native Washingtonian, he always reminds us that none of us are from, himself included, are from Washington, D.C., because there are a number of indigenous peoples that lived on this land for a very long time before Europeans came and stole the land from them. And my daughter's first school she went to, before every meeting, they would always acknowledge that and would have a moment kind of silence and just creating this space so we would never forget and never take for granted whose land that we're on. And that makes all of us guests in the city of Washington, D.C., essentially. But despite that, there's people who've been here for generations and generations and generations, and they're the ones that make D.C. what it is. All the good things of DC, it's because of them. And all of us who moved to the city for a reason and for a purpose need to know that and respect that and try to listen to the nuances that that brings.
I love that language, listen to the nuances, because that takes intentionality and really watching for and paying attention to. By virtue of walking the city like I did, there was so much that I saw, and yet there was so much that I missed. And I knew that even walking. There was one example, the big pandas that are painted for different color for the zoo that DC did a few years ago. These are like 4-foot tall concrete pandas. Different artists painted them in different ways. I walked down this alley and I didn't notice it. And I had missed the little stem on the alley. So I had to go back and I walked past and I'm like, how in the world did I miss this 4-foot tall, brightly colored panda? And I walked right by it. How in the world did I even miss that? At the extreme level, I missed that. How many more millions of things did I miss just because of not paying attention or looking the other way because I haven't spent lots of time there or asked questions of the people that have been living there for generations or spent their entire lives? In the different conversations I had with the native Washingtonians, it was fantastic to be able to get a little bit more insight into understanding where they grew up in the city itself.
That's amazing. You're so right. We often do miss these like nuances, even in places that we occupy on a daily basis. Like a similar example, just yesterday, the gym that I go to, because of just having a busy schedule, I will often drive to this gym, and I always find street free parking on this particular block on Capitol Hill in DC. And never noticed before that on the light post, there is a picture, there's a sculpture of a cat. And it's part of this like animal series that a great organization called Shaw does, where there's a lot of different animals that are hidden throughout Capitol Hill. And I have found most of them, but I've never noticed this particular cat. And I've been going to this gym for years and years and years, parking on the same block, and have never noticed it. And that's what kind of keeps us all humble and always forces us to be a student if we accept it, is that we can go to these streets that we walk every single day and still learn something new. And same with like asking questions, like even people who've been together as friends for decades, or if you're in a marriage or a committed partnership, asking different types of questions, you will unlock different parts of who they are and their past. And I still learn things about my spouse every single week just from the different questions that we'll intentionally ask each other. And so I think one of the worst things in life is to assume that you're an expert at something. because you can always learn something. And for example, so I'm trying to do the first ever guide to every neighborhood in Washington, D.C., which is taking a long time because I'm doing a guide, and I usually do an Instagram story about each of these neighborhoods. And I learned so much through it, because not only in the research, but also not only in walking the streets and alleys and talking to neighbors and business owners and community leaders within these neighborhoods, but also once I post, a lot of people will respond and say, oh, like this block is known for this, or oh, growing up 30 years ago, this happened on this block. And so I get these stories every single time I post, and it makes me appreciate and just love DC even more and its people, because I'm forever a student because of these people who are choosing to take the time to write in and just tell a story.
I do appreciate your Instagram journey. You come across great spots, and how you highlight them, I really appreciate, because you are intentional about trying to highlight the various aspects. And it's not just they have great coffee, but you give a little bit more detail about where the coffee comes from or who the owners are and the rest. So you're providing a more complete picture.
Yep.
Folks can appreciate so many aspects, whatever spot you're at.
Which is what you modeled as well when you were doing this, where you walked every street and alley in Washington, D.C. I went through, once I heard about what you were doing, I went through your Instagram, and I think this is even before you and I met, and I just took screenshots of all these things that I've never noticed before in neighborhoods that I frequent, or even neighborhoods that I don't frequent. You found just such interesting things. And I have this master Google Maps of every time there's like a new place that opens, or I read an article about some historic building or association or nonprofit, I put it on this master map of the whole DC area. And then whenever I'm in that area, I'll pull it up and to see like, oh, like F. Scott Fitzgerald and his wife Zelda's graves are a block away. I should go visit that. Oh, next door is a historic train station in Rockville, Maryland. I should go visit that. And I always note in the notes section on the Google Maps entry how I heard about it. And there are many Ken references on this map because of what you found and what you posted. So I appreciate it. And you also told kind of the real stories of these neighborhoods.
Very important to acknowledge those of where we're at. Now, you had mentioned your practice with your wife or your partner on learning more. I can't let that one go, because you said you ask great questions, or you're going back and forth with questions. What does that practically look like?
So ever since my wife and I have been dating, we are intentional with our time, and that's gotten more complex, but also very much needed as we've moved into parenthood with our 7-year-old daughter. But we still go on a weekly date, and sometimes we go out to a restaurant. Sometimes we walk to the National Mall when it's not cold out. My wife does not like the winter. Or we just stay inside and watch a movie or have dinner or drink a glass of wine. But we often will ask each other intentional questions, not only about like, how was your week, but also like, where were the high points or low points? Or we'll ask like, where do you see ourselves as a family in the next 5 years and 10 years? What are your biggest disappointments? What was it like growing up in your family when you were the age of 7? All these different, both general but also specific questions, just to continue to unlock the stories of each of us and to know each other better, but also to see how we've evolved and changed. I once read a quote that if you're in a committed relationship for your entire life or most of your life, you will be in that relationship with 7 different people because we all change. Absolutely. And there's something kind of, one, scary about that, but also very beautiful at the same time. And through questions, we see these other sides of each other, and then we can celebrate that and support each other and just get to know each other even more. And we often will joke at restaurants. Even on Valentine's Day, for example, we went out to a restaurant that was new to us, and both she and I are extroverts, so we enjoy the conversation. And there are just many other couples that don't talk as much as we do at a restaurant, and which is totally fine. That doesn't mean there's something wrong. Maybe they're 2 introverts that are married to each other, or they just need the space just to have silence. And my wife and I have silence too. But because we often love to ask each other questions, we are just constantly talking throughout an entire date. Whereas the next table, they're like maybe are on their phones for 20 minutes and then they'll talk and then have silence for another 20 minutes. That's definitely not my wife and I.
Wow. That's great that just as a practice, you both have seen the value of questions and using them to mine the depths of each other to understand and appreciate. It's going to give a platform to address things more quickly rather than allowing things to build up over time and cause problems. If you're having these conversations more regularly, where it's not the big things, it just is going to allow for diffusing. If you hit those on these weekly conversations and drawing each other out, it's going to be so much better, such that it doesn't kind of be pent up. You always do that. You've been doing this the last 10 years and I hate it. Why didn't you tell me 10 years ago? And I would have put the seat up or down and we could have 10 years of pain avoided had we just had these conversations.
Oh, totally. It's so true. Yeah, I think there's so much pain caused just from not ever asking people questions about just who they really are. Or in any relationship, even if it's a very healthy relationship, there's going to be this natural tension and the resentment will creep in. And we find to just ask each other these questions is helpful. I remember my wife likes to tell the story in our first year of marriage. After like a month of marriage, we went out and had a series of questions that we shared ahead of time to come prepared. And one was, what are some of like the tension points in the last month of, in our case, like living together for the first time? And my wife is a much more hopeful person. So she's like, oh, in general, everything's great. And I came with a list because I love lists and of things that I would love to improve on. So one was like doing the dishes more regularly, or my wife using our couch as a second closet where she throws her clothes, just like very minor things that don't really matter. But when we got to that question, I pulled it out and my wife was like, oh, you have a whole list of things that I need to change. And we laugh about it now where it's like, oh no, like that was helpful to talk about it then. So like resentment doesn't build, and then we could both sacrifice and meet in the middle versus me forcing her to change or me changing entirely, but to compromise. But we just find that helpful to have as a rhythm. And that's something that we try to instill in our daughter too, where we like do talk about things and it's okay to need space and sometimes need space for a while, but you need to communicate that to people. And I just really appreciate that my daughter, one, is more like my wife in this way. She just has high emotional intelligence, where my daughter, sometimes I'll pick her up from school and she'll say, hey, Papa, it's been a hard day. I just need to drive in silence home. And I really appreciate that, because if she weren't able to communicate that, I would ask her questions and want to connect. And that would just be exhausting for her. And she might be annoyed or snappy at me, versus her be able to communicate that and what she needed creates that space to have a more fruitful conversation and more robust questions that are asked later on.
That is remarkable that you and your wife have led by example, because your daughter, she wouldn't have come up with that on her own. So you've taught her the language and you've been that example. And for her to have that comfort and freedom to be able to make that statement, to be able to express what she is truly encountering. This is one of the reasons that I was so looking forward to this conversation, because I knew that there'd be opportunities like this to hear, to think about how much healthier of a human she is going to be, in that she is able to understand at 7 years old and to be able to communicate that out. Her ability to go through the teenage years and navigate those waters based on this freedom and this self-awareness, she is going to encounter, it's going to be far better for her, right? Because she'll have this range to be able to express and to know what's going on internally and not just have to stuff the feelings like, historically has been the case of just, this is what boys do, this is what girls do, you shut things off, or all these different things that we've established in our lexicon and the way that we move in and through the world. That is a thing of beauty, that your daughter was able to express that in a safe place, and you also fully acknowledge that. I mean, that's a beautiful moment.
Yeah, it is. It is. Yeah. And in that way, I think being a parent has been very much healing, because that's why I love hearing people's stories and asking questions, because each of us, the billions of people who are on this earth currently, everyone is different and has a different story that's just nuanced. And you can only know that by creating the space to listen to them. So same with my daughter. It's been fun to get to know her as her own person, even like outside of our family unit. And I am grateful that her mind just works more like my wife's, where she's able to, one, know what she's feeling and name it, and then know what she needs to help process it in a healthy way, and then can communicate that kindly to people around her, is very helpful. And I mean, like myself included, and so many of my friends, we've been through therapy just so often in our lives, just to start to know how to name the feelings that we have and how to appropriately communicate that. So I'm glad that she is starting early now. And part of it is thanks to the time that my wife and my daughter have every night. My wife is my daughter's like safe place, and they just process the world together every single night. All the different confusing interactions that you have. Just humans are messy and sticky, and social dynamics are. So even just going to school as a first grader, there's just so much going on. And even driving to school, like from our neighborhood to the school that she goes to, there's just so much to process. And she asks so many questions, as kids do. And it helps me have more empathy on her and others. And I just really, really enjoy it. So for example, we live in Southeast DC in a neighborhood called Fairlawn. And we're very close with all of our neighbors, our whole block, most of whom grew up in this neighborhood. And they've been the most welcoming people, where they've welcomed us into their block parties and families. And we always look out for each other. But we have to drive through this main road that goes through Fairlawn. And there are people who are experiencing homelessness. There are people who are experiencing addiction to drugs. There are a number of sex workers along that street. And my daughter will often kind of ask questions about that, and then she'll come up with her own conclusions. So she recently said how she wants to become president because she's really worried that if you get hurt and need to go to the hospital, but you don't have enough money to pay for the hospital, will they just deny helping you? And so essentially she came up with universal healthcare is what she wants to champion. And that was a result of just asking questions, like her asking questions of me of what she was seeing, me asking her questions about what she thought, and just keeping it more open-ended. And it is such a joy to see her reach these conclusions on her own, just based on her question asking and what's before her eyes.
With your daughter asking so many questions and being so inquisitive, which I'm only going to encourage, after a long, full day, it can be arduous. So how is it that you internalize, how is it that you process a very inquisitive daughter with all the questions coming at you? How do you handle that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Part of it, I think, is personality. My wife and I really, truly do like to learn. And we both have a lot of energy. And so I don't often get annoyed by her questions, because it's a fun challenge to navigate, and it just teaches me so much. But more than that, I think you also need to be grounded in the fact that none of us are experts, and often the questions she asks, especially about the people experiencing poverty that she sees, for example, are just things you see living in a major city in the United States of America, and the tensions that causes. We just really enjoy just like those nuances and her questions. And even when we're tired from a long day of work, it is energizing to us. But we also have to realize that and be confident that we just don't know many of the answers and be okay with that and not feel insecure about that. The times where I find myself getting a little bit annoyed, it's because internally I feel insecure because like I actually don't know how to solve the housing crisis or how to navigate gentrification or healthcare. All these things that politicians have strong opinions on and they're all opposite of each other. that And that's when I can get a little bit annoyed, is when I feel insecure that, oh, I don't know the answer. But if I feel secure, the fact that I don't know the answer and it's more of a journey and that's the adventure, is to like, oh, it's like, let's talk about it. And here's what I think. Here's what I see. What do you think? What do you see? And that is more of a journey versus something that is thrown on me where I need to be the expert, if that makes sense.
It does. Using that journey as a launching point in all of the travels that you've done. At this point, how many countries do you think you've been to?
Been to close to 100.
Okay. And then what's near the top of the list of places that you want to go that you haven't been yet?
Oh, so many places. Honestly, growing up where I grew up in the Kazan is known as one of the gang capitals of Russia. And so it's one of those places I loved growing up there, but you're just exposed to just a lot more than if I grew up in a different context. And so I never have been scared traveling ever, truly, in some remote places of the world, with a few exceptions, actually here in the United States, in rural America, that was just so different from the context that I grew up in. And but I really am fearless that I will go to every single country, and I really would love to visit every single country, even those that are deemed to be more dangerous. Mm-hmm. But I really do like cities. So I think the top of my list, I've never been to Australia, and despite that, I grew up with a lot of Australians because the main foreign community in Kazan were Australians, mm-hmm. and a lot of them were from Melbourne. And Melbourne, it just seems to have everything that I love about a place. And so that is top of my list. But this summer, so every summer, because of my wife's job, we go overseas. And we will most likely be based in Athens for the whole summer, in just a few months. And my wife, Addie, and my daughter, we each get to choose a different country to travel to on the vacation part of the summer, which is the last 2 weeks. And I am considering going to either Azerbaijan, Armenia, North Macedonia, Bulgaria, or Kosovo. So all of those places are kind of top of my list and top of mind right now.
And what goes into your daughter choosing a location? What are the filters that she runs that decision through?
I think we're still discovering that, because she's just turned 7 and she's been to 25 or so different countries. And when she was a few weeks old, we went to Cuba. And that was her first country, and she seemed to enjoy that, even though she was just a few weeks old. But out of all of our travels, 2 summers ago, we were in different parts of Mexico, and she even this morning said that her favorite country in the world is Mexico. And we're not just talking the beaches of Mexico, but we were based in Mexico City, and then the second largest city, Guadalajara. And she just really enjoyed that. She loved the food. She loved the people. She loved the natural beauty. And so she often talks about that. This past summer, we went to 23 different cities throughout Europe. And when we ask her favorite city out of those 23 European cities, she says Mexico. And so Mexico is her favorite. But in this trip, she really wants to go to Paris because of a TV show she watches called Fancy Nancy, where Fancy Nancy goes to Paris, and that's her dream. But the week that we're going to do vacation is right during the Olympics, the Summer Olympics in Paris. So I doubt we'll actually go to Paris because everything is very expensive because of that.
Right.
So, but I think my daughter does she likes good food. She likes interesting and friendly people. And she actually does enjoy beaches. My wife and I are not beach people at all. And so every time people recommend beach destinations, and a lot of Americans seem to enjoy the beach, we just have no desire to go. And I do believe you can find beauty in every place. And so a beach trip is fine, but we would never choose it ourselves. But we now try to incorporate that into our travels because of my daughter. So a few months ago, we went to Costa Rica, which is a place that is beautiful. But if my wife and I had our way, we would just stay near the volcanoes or in San Jose, their biggest city. But because of my daughter, we went out to the Pacific coast and spent a few days on the beach. And my daughter loved it. She loves like dancing with the sunset on a beach, which is beautiful. But for my wife and I, after like 5 minutes on a beach, we're like, cool. All right. What next? Where do we go?
What is part of your calculus? What kind of questions do you and your family ask yourselves as you are looking at different places to go and to experience them and to suck the marrow out of the opportunity?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's a similar approach to going to different neighborhoods in DC. We often will ask, what is the context in which we're stepping ourselves into? And so we ask a lot of questions about the history. And not just the history, but also the cultural history of like, how did it feel for the masses of the people during these periods of time in this country's history? So for example, in Russia, you have like Russian history, which is a very robust history of many twists and turns. But if you just read the history books, it often talks about different monarchs and Catherine the Great and Ivan the Terrible, which conquered the city I grew up in and did a lot of horrible things. But it often leaves out, what did it feel like? What was the experience for the people during those times? And so we try to ask the questions related to that. We often, because of the growing up overseas, I have a lot of friends in most countries in the world. So I will often talk to them and just ask them, like, what's the historical context? What's the culture like now? What are the biggest joys that you've seen in the people there? What are some of the biggest disappointments or tensions, just so you are aware of it and you treat it respectfully? So for example of that is we were in Athens this past summer as one of the 23 cities. And I was running. I went on a 3-hour run early in the morning, one of the best runs I've ever done, because I saw a lot of different parts of Athens. But I ran through a neighborhood that is being gentrified. And it looked very similar to all the other neighborhoods I was running through. But because I had done the research and had asked some questions of friends who live in that area, I was aware of that. And so I kind of like in that neighborhood, I decided I didn't want to contribute to that. So there's a main running path that goes through it and so I stayed on that versus like going down alleys, or I didn't want to disrupt kind of the flow of things there. And so knowing those nuances is just really helpful. And that goes into the types of questions that we ask when we travel. But then also, how do we be responsible travelers as well? Is it better to stay in a hotel, for example, versus an Airbnb or some other type of lodging? What's better for the earth? Like, do we do public transit? And then making sure that we're not a family that does tours or hires guides, but if we were, are they ethical? Are they local? Do they give back to the community? And then we often do actually research and ask questions of nonprofits in the area, just to see what are the social issues and what are the complexities to their work in this given location. So yeah, well, a lot of different questions that we ask. And then of course, like when it comes to just like the travel part we all love to explore. And so knowing the neighborhood specifics and their backgrounds and current context and where they hope to go in the future. But then also, what are some of the like mom and pop shops that don't have a marketing budget that have really good food or really good drinks or really good experiences their stories are often untold. And one, do they want people to come? And if they do, we enjoy visiting those places over the like lists that are like top 5 places to visit in Lisbon or Moscow.
How do you find those places? And that was interesting that you stated that, do they want us to come? That's an interesting twist that I had never considered. Normally I would think, oh, it's a restaurant that's open, so therefore, by all means, my dollars will be a blessing if I show up. But by the way that you state that, maybe I may not be a blessing showing up. Can you talk a little bit about that?
You're right. You would think that if they're open, they would want more business and more people to come. But sometimes that brings other things that people don't love. So for example, like on my Instagram, the people who follow me, it's not lost on me that a lot of realtors follow me on Instagram. A lot of developers will follow me on Instagram. And sometimes, so some of these mom and pop shops don't want their stories told in a more public way because they don't want, one, they don't have the staff or resources to handle the influx of business that it might bring, but also they are wondering about the change that it might bring to the people who are in that neighborhood as well. And so I have a whole list of places in DC that don't want their stories like told. Either they've like, and so I will often ask, especially if it's a like mom and pop shop, like I ask permission if I can talk about it. And most say yes, but there are a number of people that are like, no, actually, I would appreciate you not sharing. And I always want to be respectful of that because they don't want an influx of people to come who may not be respectful about it. It's kind of a similar logic to all these major tourist destinations that are now being overrun that by tourists that aren't as respectful, and there's just so many of them that it's starting to take away the magic of a place. And of course, trying to find these off the beaten path places, you run the risk that those off the beaten path places will now become very popular as well, and they're no longer off the beaten path. So it's something you have to constantly kind of steward and just ask questions to the owners and the people who are from there. Like, do you want these stories told?
That's an amazing perspective of really caring for those people that you encounter. Because I would come in with the perspective of, oh, let me share stories of this beauty. And to your point, for those people that it affects directly, it may not be a good thing. So to ask, at least give them the opportunity to be able to have their voices heard is powerful. That's an amazing takeaway.
Yeah, and there are a lot, especially in the neighborhood that I live, like in Southeast DC, there's a lot of places that are like truly the best places to see the city skyline and the best place to see the sunset along the Anacostia River or the best graffiti art or street art. And these are places that my neighbors don't want the story told because it's like their special place. And they don't want these like newcomers to come with their Compass coffee cup and be like, oh my goodness, look at this sunset. And have all these people come because they may miss out on the context and the people behind the place. And it's something that you should always be respectful of.
That's beautiful. Well, if we can shift a little bit and talk on the business side of things, that was very rich. Thank you. The company you've set up, Curiosity and Connection, as it's stated at the top, really about bringing together this media consulting, and also with your travel guides as well. In the world of media consulting, what led you or kind of the shift away from the nonprofit world to the Coca-Colas and the Washington Posts of the world?
Yeah, so having grown up, so my parents work in development. And so I grew up around a lot of people who work for international aid organizations and nonprofits. And I always thought I wanted to work for an international nonprofit, which I did as my first job. I worked for what's become the leading anti-trafficking organization and anti-slavery organization in the world called International Justice Mission. And I was, just because I happened to be the youngest person on staff around the time, this is going to date me, but that was when Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, now called X, and some other platforms were just starting, and brands were starting to create accounts on them. And so I was asked, hey, like, you're 22, can you create a Twitter account for us or a Facebook page? And that kind of just led into this world where I have led social media for the organization, and then what's called influencer marketing. So working with people with an online platform to support the work that we were doing, and just really fell in love with that work. And it was very missional, but it's all that I knew. And so I knew at some point I wanted to go into corporate America to just learn. I truly love learning different things. And so I had to kind of learn as much as I could in the nonprofit space and knew I could learn even more faster at a big company like Coca-Cola because they have more resources, they have bigger problems to solve in some ways. And so I moved over to one of their organic and fair trade brands. And so it was the more missional side of Coca-Cola and led social media and influencer marketing for them. And then that's what led me to the Washington Post. I was over what's called talent brand and talent marketing, and social media is a big part of that. And so my whole career has been in social media. And while I was at the Post, kind of just stumbled into writing for the Post as well, which was a masterclass in learning how to ask questions of people that you're interviewing and just being curious. Journalists should be, if they're not naturally curious people. And that was an amazing experience. But then my wife and I, we do what's called Odyssey planning, where we kind of create 3 different options of how we want our life to look and feel and be in the next 5 years. And then we both kind of go off and create what we want and then come back to the table and talk about it and create this Odyssey plan together. And the plan that we created was we wanted more global experiences. We would love to move overseas at some point. And in order to do that, what can we do now to help set us up for that? And so my wife moved over to a global company as an executive that required a lot of travel. And then I knew that it was time for me to start my own consultancy around social media to give me flexibility to travel with her and with my daughter as well. And that's what led me to leave the Post. I loved working for the Washington Post as a full-time employee. And so it was a hard decision, but I did it for the flexibility and launched my own company. And so I do 70% social media consulting and strategy work for a lot of companies. And then I do 10% writing for the Washington Post, for some other publications, and then 20% these travel guides. And that 20% of the travel guides, I don't ever want to monetize that part of my work. There's ways to monetize it, but I really do want to connect people deeper with DC, with the world. And so those guides should be free to people. And so the 70% social media consulting and 10% writing funds the 20% of my time to devote to the travel part of it. And I can do it from anywhere in the world. So now anytime my daughter is on break from school, we go overseas to a different part of the world with my wife's job. And then I do writing while I'm there, a lot of travel writing and travel content in each of the places that we visit. So it's been great. It's kind of given the life that we've wanted. I still write for the Post. For a long time, once I left, I was a consultant and contractor for the Post. So still deeply connected to all the places that I've worked. But it's been nice to have the flexibility to work from anywhere in the world.
Nice. I love the Odyssey planning you mentioned. Is that something that you do continuously, or say once a year in December, we're going to have a conversation?
Yeah, we do. We do it as often as we need to. So usually it's every year we'll do it. But if there's going to be some major shifts in like work or career, we'll do it throughout the year. So actually my wife and I decided we're going to do it again, kind of revisit the Odyssey plan. And that idea came out of a book called Designing Your Life, which is the only career book I've ever found helpful because it's based on design thinking. It's based on a course at Stanford University that these 2 designers created, where they use design thinking, which is all about asking questions about what a end user wants from an experience, an online experience usually. And they took that model and applied it to helping people figure out what they want to do with their lives, not just career, but their holistic life. And it really is how you do design thinking is you ask people these deep questions and a series of deep questions to get them to understand what it is that they want and want to experience. And so because of that, it gives you homework throughout the reading of this book. And it's the only career book I've found helpful. And the end result of that is creating this Odyssey plan that you then just try. It's all about just testing and learning. Everything's data. So if you don't like an experience, it wasn't a wasted experience because now you have data to know that you don't want to do that. And so as part of reading that book years ago, we go through the homework on an annual basis, sometimes 2 or 3 times a year.
Wow. So based on that data, I'm assuming it hasn't been all roses or happy sunshine. And I'm sure that you have come across some things where you're like, oh, nope, this is not something for us. Is that the case, that you've encountered some of those hard decisions?
Yeah. I think the hardest decision around it is because the idea is to create 3 different versions, because often in life, there's so many different options. And I waste a lot of time trying to figure out, but what is the best one? And fear that I'm making the wrong choice versus, here's 3 great options that are entirely different from each other, and just choosing one and just testing it out and trying, but then being okay, but not holding too tightly to it, because you may let go of that Odyssey Plan 3 to go and test out Odyssey Plan 1. And so in our case, we have 3 Odyssey plans, where one is like continuing to stay in DC, a city that we love, a city that we have strong community in and roots in now. And how do we just be intentional and even more engaged in living here in DC? And then the other one is living this dualistic life where we're based in DC for most of the year, but have the flexibility to travel both for leisure, but also for work all around the world more frequently. And then Odyssey Plan 3 is like actually uprooting our lives here and moving to a different country for a more permanent period of time. And we always go back between the 3. So the one that we are currently implementing is the second one, which is being rooted in DC. We own a property here in DC. Our community is here. My daughter's school, which we love and she loves, is here. But then on breaks, so every summer, most December's spring break, we go overseas.
Beautiful. You've mentioned community. How do you intentionally go about becoming a part of developing a community? So as you would think about moving to another city, what does that look like, or just what you've done to foster community where you live?
Yeah, that's the scariest part of Odyssey Plan 3, actually moving overseas more permanently, is leaving behind community. And then how do you start community again? And I'm in my late 30s. So what does that look like when everyone is 22 and fresh out of university and trying to make friends in this new place? And so it looks very differently. But for us, like, I do think it goes back to asking questions. Like, you have to get to know people's stories. And so that just takes a lot of time and space and just goodwill to ask each other questions. And I do think it takes intentionality. I think currently in the American culture, there's a spotlight on community, and the temptation is to call everything community. So a running club is community, a book club is community, and you can definitely find community in those spaces for sure. But for me, it forces me to define what community looks like for me. And for me, it means it's a deep community. So we actually like bear each other's burdens. We know each other's stories. We celebrate how we're evolving. We just walk in this daily life with each other. And that includes high moments, but also low moments. And sometimes there's tension, but you're committed and you work through it. And we have that with a lot of different people in DC. So for most of my wife and our marriage, we have lived with housemates. And so that's like one of our communities where when you live with someone under one roof, you do get to see people in all different states and their quirks and their annoyances and their joys. And that creates a depth in community. And then you can create that in other spaces, even with people that you don't see as frequently. But it just takes a lot of intentionality, a lot of listening, a lot of question asking. And so I do think you can replicate that. The scary part is it just takes time to create that. So we may not feel like we have deep community if we move to Athens permanently, for example. That might take 3, 4, 5 years. And that's the scariest part, is the time that it takes to build that.
Appreciate the definition and also how you live life, you and your family. your definition of community is very engaging. It's not just, okay, I do the running club and that's it, home to work. Otherwise, that's my one. But it sounds like you're very intentional, involved in the lives of others, and they're involved in your lives in a much deeper and intentional way, rather than almost what is in many cases more acquaintances at best, maybe friendships, but sounds like you are all very invested and very intentional.
It is, yeah. That just does take time to figure out. Like recently, so last year we were part of this like group of people, and they really wanted community. But what we found was that they wanted community without being vulnerable. And so we would spend a lot of time together. And so, for example, we would like go to breakfast, and it was more just hanging out. We talk about like, what'd you do on the weekend? Or, oh, do you like McDonald's French fries or Burger King's French fries better? Like questions like that. And so it never really went beyond this more surface level of community. But yeah, then they would often post on Instagram, for example, be like, oh my goodness, this is our community. We're at brunch together. And what that did was the people who really do want kind of level 9 or level 10 community, it makes them feel so disconnected, but also a little bit used, where it's like, oh wait, you just want the image of community to post on Instagram versus doing the hard work of being vulnerable and learning how to be direct with people and knowing what Addie is doing, like knowing what you're feeling, naming it and what you need, and the space and the ability to communicate the space that you need. It's just hard to do that. And so the result was this kind of level 2, more surface level community. And especially about to turn 40 in the next like 2 years, like we don't have time for that. Like, and once you have deep community, you can't go back at all, because you know the possibility that it exists, and it does take a lot of work and a lot of vulnerability, which is really scary for people to do, like myself included.
What kinds of questions do you wrestle with in that deep level of community? What's an example of that community, the conversations you'd have at a 9 or a 10 community?
Yeah, one example would be like when each of our like sin, for lack of a better word, is out on the table. How do you like stay committed and celebrate the small victories in someone's life while also knowing that it may rub against one of your weaknesses or one of your like sin areas, for example. So for me, growing up, I didn't necessarily have stability. And so unconditional love is really important to me. But a lot of relationships are for a season, or they just constantly change. Again, like that example of if you know someone for your lifetime, you're going to know 7 different versions of themselves. Same with friendships. So I don't love when like social dynamics change, or if someone's like, oh, I'm part of this club now and I'm going to hang out with these people to get to know them, which means that takes away time from time that we're going to spend together. And so my attention for me is, oh, I need to control, but you actually need to let go and have the opposite of that. And that's just really hard to do when both people's weaknesses are rubbing up against each other. So like some people want more space, some people want more connection during like times of conflict, but there is beauty in like being committed to each other through all those dynamics and seasons and transitions of relationships. And that just requires a lot of deep conversations and hard conversations and conversations that involve a lot of emotions sometimes. And that's but there's always beauty in all of that. And the end result is deeper connection with each other. And that's what a level like 9 or 10 community would look like.
That's beautiful.
To me, I think everyone has their own definition of community. And the example that I gave, like, I think to those people, like, maybe that is what they want in community. So for them, maybe a level 2 is actually like a level 9. It just looks different.
Well, thank you for sharing. That's beautiful to find that depth. I've had that level of community before, and then things have shifted, and I do miss that. And you're right. It takes time. It takes the commitment on a weekly basis, multiple times a month, just to build those deep friendships. I'd heard somewhere, so can't give proper attribution, but it was something like to become a friend requires 50 hours of time together.
Yeah.
And oftentimes I'll think, hey, I've spent an hour, so that means we're friends. And it's like, well, but where is that line between associate and friend?
Yeah.
And that's why some of these long weekends or spending a week together doing travel or whatever the event is that you're happening, it's like, oh, you can walk away really feeling connection because there was some time for life to happen in there. But if you're getting together for an hour a week, it's going to take a long time to get 40 hours to start to even trip over that line into really knowing one another.
Yep, it's so true. Yeah.
And then what level of vulnerability are you willing to go to is also going to be another decider.
Yeah, totally. But are you willing to like maintain that relationship and put in the hard work and make sacrifices to spend time with them? And I do think that the older I get, one, like everyone's in different stages. And so I totally understand if someone has like 12 children and are juggling 2 jobs, that it's just harder for them to devote those 50 hours to get to know someone than someone in like at the stage I was at when I was 22. I just had more space and time. But I do think it is like very much like worth it. But also realizing that you can celebrate like an hour conversation with someone that you may never see again and still celebrate that, like, oh no, we both connected with each other. And I'm a better person for hearing a little bit of their story. But then knowing how to put that relationship in the right space where it's like, no, we're not best friends. We're probably not even friends. But at least I can celebrate that like moment in time where our paths crossed in this crazy world that we live in. And another example, I think recently I was talking to someone that I don't know super well, but they're telling me how they have this best friend that he feels like they're just starting to get to know each other. But there's a number of tensions that are coming to the surface. And he essentially was venting to me about his so-called best friend. And my question was like, what is stopping you from having this conversation with him? And he just like knee-jerk reaction was like, oh no, like I would never, like I would like don't feel comfortable like being direct like that. Like I would never share this with him. And it made me really, really sad actually for him, because he was talking about his best friend. And so if that's your best friend, that should be one of the deepest relationships that you have. And you're not able to reveal to him all these things about yourself and these tensions that you're feeling, when if he cares about you, he would want to know that. And it would be healthy for the relationship to be direct. And I just walked away from that conversation just deeply sad for this person that I was getting to know in the last few months. Because if it was my best friend, we would have those conversations because you just know each other really well. But I also understand that you have to start somewhere too, where with my closest friends, I have many conversations that were hard that I can look back to and be like, oh, despite this moment, we still are good friends. Or like, oh, despite this fight, we still are good friends. And so there's that history there. And so I understand for him, maybe he may not have that with his best friend yet. But I do think to build that deeper connection with people, you do have to be vulnerable and you have to be brave to have those direct conversations with people.
Beautiful. The bravery and willing to risk to go deeper. It's scary. Very scary.
It is. But I like that. The risk to go deeper.
In the world of media, what questions do you think we should be asking? whether it's how we use social media, how we experience media. What do you think we should be asking that we're not asking?
Question, which that in of itself is a good question. I often ask my clients that at the end. When I onboard new clients, there's a lot of questions that I ask, and you always need to leave room for follow-up questions because questions arise when you ask questions. But the last question is often like, what question am I not asking that I should be? So I like how you like phrase that. But with social media in particular, I do think there's so many questions we should be asking, and some people are asking. But despite devoting my life to social media strategy and social media, I still applaud people who intentionally choose not to engage social media because it's often for like good reasons. And so I think those questions we should always keep in mind, that the people that I'm following on Instagram, for example, I need to realize that I'm just seeing a part of their story, not the whole story. Because everyone curates. A lot of people will say social media isn't real life, and there's a lot of truth to that because you're not going to share everything online, or it can be very performative. Like the example I gave of this group of people we were getting to know, where they'd post on Instagram this like deep community we had over brunch, when if you were experiencing it there, no one would call it deep community. And so you can say anything on social media. And so that is like a question of like, how am I being authentic, but also true to the privacy of my life as well? And then how am I giving grace to people that I'm following, realizing that we're all on this journey and we're all just sharing a part of our life. But then also like, how is it affecting our culture, our mental health, comparison, all of that? Mental illness is a huge issue in the world, but especially in the United States. And with every shooting that happens, that is brought to the forefront. And I recently had a conversation with a friend how social media plays into that, where social media essentially gives everyone a voice. And I do think everyone has something to say, but not everyone, based on their experiences and teaching and upbringing and just ways they see the world, steward that as well. And so there's just a lot of hate that can be on social media.
Yep. Do you have any thoughts or encouragements about questions and how we might use them that we haven't touched on so far?
Yeah, I do think it is really important to know how to ask questions in a way that creates space to listen. And so attention that I said, a trap that I fall into sometimes is I will ask a question and then I won't even listen to the person's response because I'm too busy thinking about the next good question to ask. And so then that actually makes it about me and like my question and me appearing smart in how I'm asking questions versus making it about the other person. And so I'm no longer listening. And so one, knowing the difference, but then cultivating a space where you ask a question, let it go, and truly just listen to the person's story unfold. And a former boss of mine at the Washington Post, again, a lot of people at the Washington Post ask really good questions, but one of his tactics was he would just sit, he'd ask a question, and he'd sit and listen to the person. And then he was never quick to ask another question or was never quick to respond on what the person said. He would just create empty, quiet space. And oftentimes people would feel awkward, so they would just keep on talking and they'd fill the space. But he was the one that always said everything is data. And so you just learn so much more about the person because they just keep on talking. And then, or sometimes he would just say, what else? That's it. What else? And that just gives people the space to own their own story versus asking, oh, interesting. Like you grew up in Russia. Was that good or was it bad? Just like, that's not a very robust question. It can kind of take away some of the power of someone's own story in their own words versus a question like, what else? Gives someone permission to define it on their own terms. And again, it's more empowering, gives them more freedom. But then you also just learn so much more about their story through a simple question like that. And so really knowing how to ask those type of questions and really knowing how to listen. And some of my friends have found artificial intelligence, AI, to be helpful in knowing what questions to ask. And so I have a friend who isn't a phenomenal question asker. And so he will often go to AI and just ask, hey, here's the situation, or here's a little bit of what I know about the person. What questions would you ask them to get to know them better? and AI can be a good tool in giving good prompts and good questions. And so for people who aren't as naturally good at it, that's a good tool that you can use, but also just practice the art of asking questions and also listening.
That's a beautiful way to encapsulate much of your story, because no doubt you have been implementing that in all the many facets that you have been living life. Because whether it's listening to your daughter, listening to the people in the countries and the places that you've been, and as you've stated, in listening to your wife and building the relationship that you have, you've been implementing very much that, and just allowing the listening to be able to follow up with the questions. Wonderful. Where would be the best places for folks to engage with you and learn more about what you're excited about and reach out if they so desire?
So my website is austinkgraff.com. And then in all social media platforms, I just have the same name. And that's Austin K. Graff on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, LinkedIn, X, all the platforms.
Well, Austin, thank you, my friend, for sharing your experiences and how questions have woven throughout your entire story. Very, very grateful that you joined us here.
Thanks for having me. And thank you for your thoughtful questions as well. You are masterful at asking them.
Appreciate the encouragement. For those who have joined us through the magic of technology, thank you for being here. Questions changed my life for the better, and Austin shared an expansive story with questions and curiosity woven through business, travel, and family. An action for you is to explore how answered and unanswered questions have coursed through your life and what questions await your attention today. Please take all that you have learned here and be a light to those around you. Gratitude shout out to Beauty Pill for the show's music and producer Ben Ford for the technical help. This episode was recorded on Piscataway land, and please engage with this episode in some manner. Download, follow, save, like, share, or comment about something that resonated. This action ensures we are engaging the questioning community. So until next time, keep questioning.